Hello, everyone. This is going to be 5.4 Alexander the Great and the Legacy of Greece in its entirety. Our objectives for this, we are going to explain how Alexander the Great built an extensive empire, and it was rather extensive. We are going to describe the empire's cultural impact, and we're going to identify the major Hellenistic Greek scientists and their discoveries and innovations. Mainly, they are out of a city named after Alexander the Great called Alexandria. So, when we were wrapping up last section, the Peloponnesian War ended with the Spartans beating the Athenians. However, unfortunately for the Spartans, they were so depleted by the end of this long war, the Peloponnesian War, that a few years later, when the Macedonians attacked, they were able to defeat the Spartans. So, in 338 BC, the Macedonians, who were up north of ancient Greece, invaded and conquered. Especially, they went after Athens. Athens was considered, the cultural prize. And as we're going to see, the Macedonians, especially the Macedonian kings, really like the idea of Greek culture. So, this was the time period of independent Greek city states being done. This is the beginning of the consolidation of the Greek city states into one empire. The eventual leader of the Macedonians, first Philip and then his son Alexander, took Greek culture and kind of made it their own and also made it unique. They blended it with several other different cultures, and he took it around the world. So let's look at Alexander the Great. The Macedonians were Greek. Actually, modern day Macedonia. There's a country called, anyway, I'm about to get confused. There's a modern day country called Macedonia, but however, the ancient empire of Macedonia, here we go, is nowadays part of modern Greece. The Macedonians were Greek, and they still held on to those Greek connections. And like I said, they're a big fan of Greek culture. So the king of Macedon, a guy named Philip II, especially liked Greek culture. He had been born and raised there. He even got special tutors for his son, Alexander. Alexander of Macedon, soon to be known as Alexander the Great, actually had the great philosopher Aristotle as his basically school teacher. So here's Philip II. He's the one with the beard. And over time, Philip II continued to grow in power. He made alliances with several Greek city states, and if that didn't work, he just took them over instead. And in 338 BCE, Philip of Macedon defeated the Athenians and united the Greek city states under Macedonian control, or at least he started to do this. So, this is ancient Macedon in the time of Philip II. You can still see that the bottom of ancient Greece is still not in his control. However, it will be eventually. So, Philip II wanted to conquer the Persian Empire too. He had never been a fan of the Persians because they were the enemies of the Greeks. And he wanted to go after them, but before he could, Philip II was stabbed to death. He was assassinated. Assassination is what we call it when a person is murdered, usually for political reasons. After the death of Philip II, his son Alexander took over, and here is that death of Philip II. Despite what some people may want you to believe, Alexander had nothing to do with his father's death. So, Alexander the Great became king when he was about 20 years old. However, he had been a general for about the time since he was about 13 years old before this. So he knew his way around a battlefield. And he basically wanted the same thing his dad did. He liked Greek culture, and he wanted to conquer Persia. Persia is not the powerhouse that it once was back in Unit 2, where Persia was, the big, powerful empire way back then. Now they are a little bit smaller, but a little bit of a less of a powerhouse than they once were. And so Alexander the Great went after Persia. He won numerous victories against the Persians. And then he went through the Middle East. He conquered Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia by 331 BCE. So he is really going through the ancient Mediterranean empires. So here is Philip II, or Philip II, Alexander, his son. This is Alexander of Macedon, aka Alexander the Great. He's the one with the beard? He doesn't have a beard. We finally found the one Greek guy who doesn't have a beard. So he was in power from 356 to 323 when he died. He is from Macedonia. He was a general. He was a king. He really liked to name a lot of cities after himself too. There are over 70 Alexandrian cities in the Mediterranean area. And he was really after the Persians, like I said. His big fish was he wanted to kill the emperor of Persia, a guy named Darius. However, when somebody else did that, one of Darius's second in command basically wanted to appease Alexander the Great, so he killed Darius. That didn't make Alexander happy because Alexander wanted to have killed Darius, and so he tortured and killed Bessus instead. He had that guy killed. So this is the entirety of Alexander the Great's empire, and there's that famous quote from Die Hard where he says, "And when Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no worlds to conquer." Eventually, he did stop conquering worlds, though. Alexander the Great headed east. He wanted to capture India, too, and make India part of his empire. However, his troops had basically said, "We've gone far enough. Um, we need a break." And so Alexander stopped, turned around, and headed back towards the Middle East. But he made it all the way to the Hindu Kush range. So again, if you look at the size of this map, he made it good and far. He conquered Egypt, he conquered Greece, he conquered Persia, he conquered up to the Hindu Kush mountain range. Not bad at all. Now, Alexander the Great and his army turned back. They headed back towards the Middle East, but before he could gather strength and start his campaign anew, he died. And there were a lot of stories that it was murder of some sort, but it was probably just a fever, as far as we know. He also, unfortunately, did not say who was going to have power when he was dead. He allegedly said, when somebody asked him who is to, take control of the empire, he said it should go to the strongest. Now, some people think he may have actually been saying somebody's name, but it came out sounding like to the strongest. And unfortunately, that did not narrow it down. And no one really could be another Alexander the Great after Alexander the Great. Eventually, they split up his empire into 4 sections. And for the next 300 years, these powerful emperors of these areas that used to be Alexander's territory sort of ran their own little mini empires. So here's the death of Alexander the Great, allegedly. And here are his 4 kingdoms. On the left, you can see the Ptolemaic kingdom. These are the Egyptians. The last of the Egyptian pharaohs are called the Ptolemies for this reason. We've already talked about Cleopatra in a previous lecture. We see the Antigonid Empire up north. We see the Seleucid Empire in Persia, and then the other Greek states along the Mediterranean Sea. Now let's look at the legacy of Alexander the Great. He only had a short reign as a king before the fever got him, or the murder, but it was a fever. But his love of Greek culture really helped to expand Greek culture across the ancient Mediterranean world. But he also made it so that the Greek culture kind of blended with whatever was around it when he got there. So, first of all, a lot of cities are named after Alexander, like I said. A lot of these new cities became cultural hubs. In particular, is Alexandria in the north of Egypt. Now, we also see that Greek culture and Greek religion spread to these different areas, and a lot of Greek ideas are sort of put into the mix, absorbed into the consciousness. This is a term called being assimilated. It's kind of blending in. Now, Alexander had actually been in favor of cultures blending. He didn't want it to be like, I'm going to march in and you're going to become Greeks and everything about you is going to be Greek. Instead, he took some Greek and put it into the mix, and then he kind of borrowed from the people that he conquered. He kind of became a mishmash of Greek and Persian and Egyptian and all these other sorts of things. And this blend of all these different cultures became known as the Hellenistic era. Hellenistic means Greek-like. Basically, it's almost a way of saying Greekish in Greek. So, for instance, here we see Alexander the Great as the conqueror of Egypt. However, instead of standing there in Greek robes or, Greek armor or something like that, he is dressed as an Egyptian pharaoh. Now, the center of the Hellenistic world, like I said, is Alexandria in Egypt. It was a great port city. It's easily accessible, very successful in trade. And it also became known for the education that was going on there and the knowledge and the information that was coming out of it. And also for its huge, awesome lighthouse, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world until it became a ruin after an earthquake in the 1300s. Alexander the Great was a longtime supporter of both the arts and the sciences, and you can really see this in Alexandria. There was a huge library and a huge museum in Alexandria. Allegedly, any ship that landed in port in Alexandria had to be raided, and they would take all the books that you had and carefully copy all the information down, return the books to you, and that way they had all the newest information basically in the Library of Alexandria. But it was a functioning library and university too. It was not just books, there were lecture halls, there were zoos. There was a lot of stuff there. Unfortunately, there had been several fires, including when Julius Caesar accidentally lit the whole joint on fire. Gosh darn it, Julius. But here are some of the ancient ruins of Alexandria. This is what the Lighthouse of Alexandria used to look like, we think. Now, also women in this time period, in the Hellenistic era, women did have a lot more freedoms than before. They used to be able to read and write. They were poets. The female royals definitely got some power, including Cleopatra VII, who became the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. So Cleopatra VII, we've talked about her before, is basically the last of the pharaohs. We also have Hypatia of Alexandria, another great example of a woman in power during this time period of the Hellenistic era. She's right at the tail end, actually, of the Hellenistic era as the Romans are coming into town. Hypatia lived from about 370 to 415 in the Common Era. She's from Alexandria. She is a teacher and a scientist and a mathematician. She was the head of a university, I believe, or a school at least in Alexandria. She was also killed by a Christian mob. She was a pagan. She was somebody who worshipped the old gods, and that got her into a lot of fights with the archbishop in Alexandria. She's also the only woman to show up in the painting that we looked at earlier called the School of Athens, showing all these great Greek philosophers. She's the only female great Greek philosopher, as we can see right there. Now, let's look at some of the arts and scientists, some of the big inventors of the time period. So, the Hellenistic era saw a lot of new architects and artists, all trying to sort of glorify the ancient Greeks and the Hellenistic rulers, and showing how awesome they were and how modern. Um, Now, do see new philosophers coming in at this time, including the philosopher Zeno. Zeno had a philosophy called Stoicism. This is still something very big around today, that, you should not, aspire to too much. You shouldn't push too hard. You should just sort of take what life gives you. And some people think this sounds a lot like Buddhism. Some people think it sounds a lot like sort of Taoism, but allegedly Stoicism did sort of grow out of its own thing. And Stoics believed in things like human rights. They claimed that women and slaves they may be unequal to free, men of that time period, but they were morally equal, and that meant that they should be treated as such. This would later on become important to the Romans and the Christians as well. So here is Zeno. He's the one with the beard. So the Hellenistic era also saw a lot of mathematicians and a lot of scientists too, building on a lot of the ancient knowledge. And they, like I said, they would borrow from wherever they picked it up. If they conquered a new region, they would take a lot of that knowledge and just sort of incorporate it. We have the work of Pythagoras. Pythagoras is the guy who made the theorem a squared plus b squared equals c squared that works with right triangles. His logical proofs for the methods also helped out later mathematicians and philosophers. So this is what we call the Pythagorean theorem right here. Don't ask me to explain it. There's a reason I teach history, not math. There's also a guy named Euclid. Euclid wrote a book called The Elements. The Elements focuses on the basics of geometry. And his work inspired a lot of later Roman and Islamic mathematicians. He really did a big number on math in the later days. And so next year, when you're taking geometry and you're trying to figure out what the angle of the cosine of the tangent is, you can thank Euclid for that. Again, I'm sorry for saying cosine of the tangent. Once again, I am not a mathematician. We also have scientists. Aristarchus argued that we were a heliocentric universe where the sun was at the center, not the earth. This was something that he proclaimed in ancient Greece. It was promptly forgotten. It was, in fact, something that could kill you. If you said the sun was the center of the universe in Renaissance Italy, they would burn you at the stake for it. And so it took about 2,000 years for modern science to agree with Aristarchus. We also have a great scientist who I love. I'll talk about him in class a little bit more, just the brilliance of how he figured this out. But the great scientist Eratosthenes was able to do experiments that not only proved the world was round, but he actually guessed how round it was. And he did pretty well for himself considering that he had no way of traveling around the world at that time. So this is the heliocentric model of Aristarchus. We found out later that it's actually not perfectly circular like this. It's in fact more of an oval shape that wobbles occasionally. Probably the most famous of these scientists of Alexandria, though, is a guy named Archimedes. Archimedes was he was really interested in practical inventions, not just like doing the math and being delighted by science. He wanted to see what science could do for the regular people. And so he did things like he improved on levers and on pulleys. He developed a screw that could basically, if you turn the screw, it would bring water up a hill. Just genius idea. He also invented weapons of war to defend his hometown. Allegedly, he developed a ray gun made out of mirrors, but nobody's ever been able to prove that it worked. In fact, MythBusters pretty clearly disproved that the ancient ray gun of Archimedes actually ever worked. So this is how a screw takes the water uphill. Again, I just think it's a genius idea. Now, in about 400 BCE, Hippocrates became he was a doctor looking at the causes of diseases. They were getting away from the old ideas of like how diseases spread and trying to find earthly reasons for it. And Hippocrates set out an oath that basically said doctors will do no harm. And the Hippocratic Oath is an oath that every doctor takes before they become doctors, saying that we are going to be ethical, we are going to do no harm, we will treat the patient in front of us no matter what. And so Hippocrates is sort of the start of that. My dad is a doctor, and he had to take the Hippocratic Oath when he started out. And this is Hippocrates. He, of course, is the one with the beard. And so the Greek legacy still survives. We still see it, like we talked about earlier with architecture, in our art, in our buildings, in our science. Even though the Greeks were conquered about 133 BCE by the Romans, who we're going to get to next time, Greek government inspired modern governments, including America's. Greek art inspired modern art. Greek philosophy sort of helped to set up and establish our current education system, even here in America. And later on, we are going to see the impact that the Greeks had on the Romans, too.